It is August 17, 1943, in Messina, the Sicilian port that faces mainland Italy across the strait. German forces have already pulled out during the previous nights and crossed to the mainland. The port is damaged and quiet. Infantry from the United States 3rd Infantry Division enter the city first, moving carefully through abandoned positions and unexploded charges. A few hours later, British and Canadian troops from 8th Army arrive from the east after weeks of hard fighting. Between those two arrivals, photographers record handshakes and salutes. And one simple fact enters the record. American troops are in Messina before Bernard Montgomery. On the original plan, the main route to the city was meant to belong to Montgomery and 8th Army, yet the first Allied flags in Messina are American. Officers on both sides understand what that means for prestige and for how the campaign will be remembered. Ever since, people have repeated stories about what Montgomery said when Patton beat him to the city. If we follow the paper trail from that day and from the years that follow, we can see which parts of that story rest on evidence, which parts are legend, and what Montgomery himself actually wrote about Sicily, Patton, and Messina. To see how that situation came about, we step back a few months to May 1943. Maps of the Mediterranean cover the tables in Allied headquarters. Tunisia has fallen, and Sicily is chosen as the next major objective. The aim is to take the island, open the central sea lanes, put heavy pressure on Italy, and force Germany to stretch its forces even further. Formally, Dwight Eisenhower serves as Supreme Allied Commander. Under him, British General Harold Alexander commands 15th Army Group. For the invasion of Sicily, two field armies report to Alexander. Bernard Montgomery leads 8th Army, and George Patton leads 7th Army. Their formal status is equal, but contemporary British and American accounts make it clear that the political weight behind them is not. Montgomery has recently come off the victory at El Alamein. For many British leaders, that battle seems to confirm that his careful and methodical style can deliver results. They tend to view the British Army as the more experienced partner, hardened by years of fighting in Europe and North Africa. American units, by contrast, are still building their reputation. They have taken serious losses at places such as Kasserine Pass and are seen by some Allied planners as capable but still relatively new to large-scale combat in this theatre. The initial concept for Operation Husky reflects that perception. One key prize on the island is the port of Messina in the northeast, a gateway to mainland Italy. Montgomery's 8th Army is given the most direct route toward it. His troops are to land on the southeastern corner of Sicily, advance north along the eastern side of Mount Etna toward Catania, and then continue on to Messina. Patton's 7th Army is assigned landings on the southern and western coasts. His stated tasks are to secure the western half of the island, protect Montgomery's left flank, and help hold the line against Axis counterattacks. On the planning maps, the British arrow from the southeastern beaches to Messina is shorter and more direct. The American arrow bends around the south and west, covers more ground, and does not initially reach the final objective. Historians often point to this layout as a simple visual summary of how many Allied decision-makers at that moment expected the two armies to operate. On July 10, 1943, before dawn, landing craft move in. Towards Sicily's southern shores, and Operation Husky begins. At that point, it is the largest combined amphibious and airborne assault the Allies have ever attempted, with more than 150,000 troops coming ashore in the first 3 days, supported by thousands of vehicles and aircraft. The Normandy landings will later surpass it in size and complexity, but in the summer of 1943, Husky is unprecedented. The landings succeed, despite strong winds, scattered airborne drops, and confused night fighting. On the eastern side, Montgomery's 8th Army pushes quickly through the initial Italian defenses and takes Syracuse. After that, the tempo slows. German units, including experienced panzer grenadier formations, dig in on the approaches to Catania and on the slopes of Mount Etna. Narrow roads, steep ridges, and prepared positions turn each advance into a set-piece battle, and progress becomes steady but slow. On the western and southern fronts, American units under Patton fight off Axis counterattacks against the beachheads. Once the immediate threat to the landings is contained, the situation changes. The original plan has limited how far the Americans are expected to push inland. But as Axis resistance on the western side of the island proves weaker than many planners had feared, opportunities for a broader advance appear. At this point, the command structure matters. Patton cannot simply rewrite his own mission. Any major change has to be cleared with Harold Alexander. Over several days, Patton argues for a larger role, and Alexander, weighing coalition politics alongside operational needs, authorizes him to drive northwest toward Palermo, the main port in western Sicily, and then to move on to cut the northern coastal road. Once Palermo is taken, it will offer the Allies another major harbor and a base for further operations on the island. That decision changes the shape of the campaign. Once Alexander has given that wider brief, Patton moves fast. In less than 2 weeks, American columns push along rough roads toward the northwest. They meet scattered resistance. But on this side of the island, there are fewer German units and more Italian formations that either break or pull back under pressure. By July 22, 1943, American forces enter Palermo. The capture matters. Militarily, Palermo offers a large port that can feed supplies into the Allied effort and help secure control of western Sicily. Politically, contemporary American coverage treats the fall of the island's main western city as proof that United States forces are doing more than guarding a flank. Newspapers and newsreels highlight Patton's rapid advance and give his army prominent attention. From Palermo, the next step is clear on the map. The North Coast Road runs eastward, town by town, toward Messina. Under the authority already granted by Alexander, Patton directs his forces along that route. Later, operational studies note that this path, while longer, runs behind some of the strongest German positions that are facing 8th Army around Mount Etna. The idea that this now turns into a race develops gradually. American officers, in their letters and later recollections, often stress a desire to show that their army can move as fast and hit as hard as any in the theatre. British officers, in their own reports and memoirs, frequently underline the importance of maintaining control over the main axis toward the key port in the northeast. Pride and planning sit side by side in many of those accounts. By the end of July, the fighting has settled into two very different patterns. On the eastern front, 8th Army is engaged in deliberate attacks against strong German defensive lines south and west of Mount Etna, including positions that later writers group under the label of the Etna Line. Bridges are blown, roads are cratered, and each advance needs artillery preparation, infantry assaults, and careful consolidation. Montgomery shifts units, brings in fresh formations, and tries repeated outflanking moves, but the ground tends to favor the defenders. On the northern front, Patton's forces drive east from Palermo along the coastal road, taking a sequence of towns. To avoid being held up at every roadblock, he authorizes a series of small amphibious landings beyond German positions along the shore. These leapfrog moves reduce the time and distance needed to reach the next line of resistance and keep pressure on the retreating forces. The German command in Sicily, under Albert Kesselring and Hans Valentin Huber, is not aiming to defend every mile to the last man. Their stated goal is to delay the Allies and at the same time move as many German troops and heavy weapons as possible across the Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. They use the difficult country around Mount Etna to slow the eastern advance while organizing withdrawals toward the narrow crossing. British accounts tend to treat the heavy fighting on that front as the main struggle, because that is where the strongest German units stand and where most British casualties fall. American accounts give more weight to the rapid movement along the northern coast, presenting it as evidence that their army can take and hold the initiative. By early August 1943, American troops on the north coast are clearly driving toward Messina rather than simply screening the flank. British and Canadian forces to the east are also swinging north as German formations pull back. Post-war narratives split in how they describe this phase. Some emphasize rivalry and personal competition between Patton and Montgomery. Others focus on Alexander's role and suggest that he is content to let his two armies close in on the final objective from different directions. Modern historians generally treat those strands as overlapping interpretations of the same set of orders and movements. While the Allied columns are closing the last distances on land, German engineers and naval units work at the strait. Under cover of darkness and smoke, ferries, barges, and smaller craft shuttle back and forth across the narrow water. Over the course of a little more than a week, German forces evacuate tens of thousands of soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and large quantities of equipment to the Italian mainland. Italian formations in Sicily, by comparison, suffer heavier losses and more captures. By the middle of August 1943, the outcome on the island is obvious. The Axis cannot hold Sicily, but the German command has succeeded in preserving a large part of its combat strength. When Allied patrols finally enter Messina, they find prepared demolitions and abandoned positions rather than a large German garrison waiting to be destroyed. That result shapes how both Montgomery and Patton later present the campaign. It also makes it difficult to tell a simple story about who won in Sicily, because the Allies achieve their aim of taking the island, but do not trap and destroy the main German force. On August 16, 1943, patrols from the United States 3rd Infantry Division reach the outskirts of Messina and move into the city, where organized German resistance has already ended and local authorities accept Allied control. The next morning, August 17, 1943, George Patton enters Messina in a formal procession that photographers and film crews record. American flags are raised in the streets, and a short ceremony marks the American announcement that their part of the Sicilian campaign is complete. British and Canadian units from 8th Army arrive later on August 17, 1943, after fighting their way along the eastern approaches. Operational reports and later histories are consistent on the basic sequence. American troops are in Messina first, and British and Canadian units reach the city a few hours afterward. The photographs and newsreels from that day show senior officers meeting, shaking hands, and posing together, while official communiques present Sicily as a joint success, two Allied armies converging on the final objective. At the same time, many American newspapers and newsreel companies talk about a race to Messina and stress that Patton's soldiers entered the city before Montgomery's. British coverage puts more emphasis on the heavy fighting in the Catania area and around Mount Etna, and tends to treat the question of who physically arrived first as less important. Stories about what Patton and Montgomery said to one another in the city square appear in later memoirs and anecdotes, often describing sharp, competitive exchanges. But these accounts differ in detail and are not supported by verbatim records. What can be followed more clearly is how each man later describes the campaign. In his post-war memoirs and later statements, Montgomery repeatedly presents Sicily as a successful Allied operation in which his army faced the strongest opposition. He stresses that 8th Army fought through the main German concentrations on the eastern side of the island, and argues that the decisive factor was wearing down those forces and compelling their withdrawal toward Messina. He notes that American troops reached the city first, but usually treats that as a question of routes and timing rather than as a central issue. He returns to a few main points. He argues that carefully planned and methodical operations limit casualties and increase the chances of success. He maintains that the heaviest German resistance was on his front, which is why he concentrated his strength there. He also says that once it was clear that the Germans were pulling back and that Messina could not be turned into a trap for a large enemy force, the order in which Allied columns entered the city mattered less than securing the island and getting ready for operations on the Italian mainland. He is critical of what he describes as excessive publicity and independent maneuvering by some American commanders, but he rejects the idea that Sicily was somehow lost to him by Patton's speed. In his account, both armies do their part, with British units taking much of the hardest fighting around Mount Etna. This view fits with many operational documents. German war diaries and several Allied studies show that the main German effort to slow the Allies is concentrated on the eastern approaches, while along the northern road, American forces often face lighter, although still serious, opposition. American officers and many later United States historians highlight different elements. They underline that Patton begins the campaign with a formal role focused on flank security and ends it with his soldiers standing in the final objective. They emphasize his push to expand his mission toward Palermo, his use of the northern coastal route once that shift is approved, and his willingness to employ coastal leapfrog landings as signs of a flexible approach within the overall plan laid down by Alexander and Eisenhower. In these American narratives, the race to Messina becomes a convenient shorthand for a broader change. A force that had taken heavy criticism after Kasserine in early 1943 is now shown conducting rapid and coordinated advances in difficult country. A general who is often described as volatile uses his drive and aggressiveness to produce visible results while still operating inside a coalition command structure. An army that many allies initially saw as a junior partner shows that it can keep pace with, and in some cases move faster than the long-established British army. Patton's own letters and post-campaign comments often describe the closing stages in competitive terms, and he makes clear that he is proud of having reached Messina before Montgomery. That way of talking about the end of the campaign helps fix the idea of a race in the public mind, even though the formal orders for both armies continue to come from above and the larger strategy remains in the hands of Eisenhower and Alexander. Many modern historians take a cautious view of what people call the race to Messina. They generally accept that rivalry and national pride were real influences. British doubts about American combat experience are often mentioned as one reason the original plan gave 8th Army the main axis. On the American side, officers were sensitive about being treated as a junior partner, and later, memoirs link that feeling to Patton's drive to show that 7th Army could do more than protect a flank. The fact that American troops entered Messina first then fed those feelings and helped shape how both nations talked about Sicily afterward. At the same time, detailed studies of Operation Husky stress some hard limits. Harold Alexander, as Army Group Commander, approved Patton's moves to Palermo, and then along the north coast, so Patton was pushing his remit but not fighting an independent war. Operational records show that the main German delaying battles were fought against 8th Army on the eastern approaches, where strong German formations and difficult ground combined to slow the Allied advance. The organized evacuation across the Strait of Messina meant that neither Allied army destroyed the core of the German force in Sicily, no matter who walked into the city first. Because of that, when historians today use the phrase race to Messina, they are usually talking about perceptions and prestige. Officers on both sides knew who was closer to the city, and American commanders in particular cared about the impact of arriving first. But both armies still operated under common orders and within the wider constraints of terrain, German decisions, and coalition strategy. Messina on August 17, 1943, is therefore often treated less as a simple finish line and more as a snapshot of these overlapping pressures. American soldiers are photographed in the captured port while British units are moving in from the east, and German units are already across the water. Later writing about Montgomery and Patton frequently uses Sicily as one of the examples of their contrasting styles, with Montgomery linked to careful preparation and Patton to speed and quick exploitation. But that discussion now sits alongside the evidence for how much their freedom of action depended on higher command. For many historians, this is the lasting value of the episode. It shows how rivalry, national pride, and personal style all mattered. But it also shows that the outcome in Sicily was shaped just as much by formal authority and by German choices as it was by any race between two famous generals. Thank you for watching. Hit like and subscribe for more history from the World War II Vault, and click the video on the screen to watch another.